Hi guys, my name is Pasha Ivanov. Thanks for joining the class, and let's get started with the particles first. This is a first example that I put together before the recordings, and it illustrates what we would like to accomplish first, so we know what we're doing before we start. So as we can see, the particles being emitted from a polygon plane here, and they move in for straight up along positive y-axis, and as particle enters this volume defined with the cube, or let's say like a scale cube, the particle per particle attribute color is being affected or changed. So let's start doing this class with from a scratch, and I will be moving quite fast, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask on the forum. I would be more than happy to answer any possible question you might have. So let's go to File, New Scene, and let's just create a polygon plane, scale it up so we can clearly see it, and then let's emit the particles from it. We're going to Dynamics module by selecting Dynamics from a pull-down menu, and then Particle menu, Emit from Object, open the option box, and from here choose a surface as emission type or emitter type. Particle rate to 100 is more than sufficient right now. Speed is 10. Normal speed to 1, and other two speeds to 0. Hit apply and close. And let's just change the last frame, the animation, to 1000. Let's rewind to the beginning of the frame and hit playback. As we can see, the particles start moving, emitted, and immediately moving up along the y-axis. Let's stop this animation and rewind back to the first frame. And first of all, let's change the particle life from default live forever to lifespan pp only. And let's change the lifespan of the particles from undefined yet to, let's say, 4. So we just copy the attribute from a selected object and attribute field and paste it into the expression editor and put the equal sign to 4. Create, close. So if we play back the animation now or simulation, we would be able to see that each particle dies exactly 4 seconds after it's been emitted. Right. So another attribute that I would like to add to these particles is the color pp, or per particle color attribute. We accomplish this by hitting the color button and choose add per particle attribute instead of add per object attribute or shader. So it's in the middle. Hit add, and by hitting add, we see a new attribute called RGBPP listed under the per particle array attributes. Right click on that attribute, choose once again creation expression, copy the name of the attribute and paste it below lifespan statement, and put the following syntax. Is the 2 arrows like this: 1 for red, 0 for green, 0 for blue. 1 is a full intensity color, which is equal to red first, 1. 0, no color for green, no color for blue. Edit, OK. Switch to the shaded viewport by hitting 5 on your keyboard and playback. As you can see, every particle is being represented with the red color. So now the next step is to define a value. The value is being defined by the field. The reason is because there is already internal calculation that happens while when particles being evaluated. And this calculation is quite fast. So let's just select a gravity field for this example, or turbulence field. By default, the turbulence field is created with no boundaries. So in order to change this from being infinite field to isolated by volume, we choose volume shape to cube. The size of the field that's been created with default settings is quite small, so let's scale it up a little bit and move along the y-axis, so it kind of, overlaps with the stream of the particles. Let's play back this animation. And nothing yet happens. First of all, is because the turbulence magnitude is quite low right now, so let's put it 100 and the attenuation to 0, meaning like the magnitude of the force inside of this cube of field is actually equal from the border to the center. Okay, so let's play back again, and we can see the particles as they enter the field being affected by the turbulence. Okay, so but that's not exactly what we would like to do for this particular example. What we would like to do is to affect per particle attributes as they enter the field. Okay, so for this example, first we need to decide what exact per particle attribute we would like to change. So since we already add two per particle attributes, one is the lifespan, another is a RGBPP, which is a color. So let's change RGBPP, or color of the particle, as it enters the volume of the field. For the first thing we need to do is to make sure that we know the name of the attribute that the particle stores already internally. So these are, if we select our particle, go into Windows, Relationship Editor, Dynamic Relationship. On the left side, we can see our particle is being selected, and on the right side, we see what node it's been connected to. So we do see that there is a relationship between the particle and the turbulence field. What Dynamic Relationship Editor does not show is that what attributes are being connected. In order to see the attributes themselves, we can use a hypergraph or hypershade. I would be using a hypershade. You might want to use a hypergraph. It really does not matter. So I go to rendering and the hypershade. And while particle being selected, I click show input and output connection. I find the particle node here, and I find a turbulence field node. And I do see the two arrows that connects each together. So the first one is a so-called outgoing connection, another one is incoming connection. What we're interested in is in incoming connection. And this incoming connection, if you place the arrow above this, the mouse above the arrow, you would be able to see the name of the attribute of the field that is being connected to the particle shape hidden attribute that is called input force 0. Input force 0, like there. What you can do, most of the time, it's kind of hard to memorize what exact syntax for the attribute is. I can open a script editor, right? Let's open it just by clicking on the square icon at the bottom of the screen. And what I can do, I can select this arrow and hit delete button. And as you can see, it outputs the result of this command, like with the name of what attribute has been disconnected. And I can copy and paste this name of the attribute into the let's say new tab mel. Okay, so I can reuse it later. And since I need that connection back, now I need to undo. So let's say undo undo disconnect, right? So now it's connected back like it always was. And now, knowing the attribute of this node, I can go into script editor for the particle. So let's go to select particle. Let's switch to wire view by hitting the 3 on your keyboard. And right click on RGBPP and choose runtime before dynamic expression. And here, first of all, what we would like to do is to declare a variable, and the type of the variable will be a vector. The reason why the variable will be a vector is because it needs to receive three numbers that this particular attribute that is connected to the turbulence field is outputting to. So what we would like to do in our expression editor is say that type of the variable is a vector, name of the variable is the field magnitude, for example, right? Or force, let's say like this, force, like this, okay? And it's equal to, and we equal to that name of the attribute that the particle received from a field, and we say create. So now, if I print the value stored in this particular variable we just declared, I would be able to see what influence of the field on each particular particle, okay? So I rewind back, and the print statement will print out into the command prompt. So I hit OK, and I can see that 0, 0, 0. That's because none of the particles yet enter the field. As soon as the particle will enter the volume of the field, the value that's stored in a field force variable that is being captured, that is capturing the data from input for 0 attribute that is connected to the turbulence field, will be non-zero. So now, knowing the vector value, I'm now able to turn vector variable to float variable. So let's say, and the float variable needed to make some kind of simple comparison math later. So I declare in the float variable, like it can be any name, let's say float field force, just like to keep things readable enough. And what I do, I use a magnitude function, which is a predefined in Maya, and it deals with the kind of with the vector variable types, actually used for something else, but it's perfect for this kind of scenario here. And as a result of this line here, the vector variable field force will turn into the float. Okay, so now if all the three components of the field force vector variable are 0, the result of the magnitude command will be resulted to 0 float number, meaning like if we got a float equal to 0, that would mean that the particles got no effect of the field. If it's not 0, then particle is being affected by the field, and the only reason why the particle will be affected by the field is because it's inside of the field volume. Okay, so now next we go to if function or if statement, and inside of as a comparison evaluation we will put like if the float field force is not equal, or yes, is not equal to 0, right? Then do something here, right? And that something we would like to do is to change the particle color. So we can say particle shape 1 RGBPP is equal to, and then we need to define a vector value that is following this particular syntax that we used already when we define a color particle in the creation expression. And instead of putting a red color, let's put 0 for the red, 0 for the green, and full intensity 1 for the blue. So what that will make is that it will turn every particle into blue colored as soon as it enters the turbulence field. So let's rewind back to the beginning, switch to the shaded view, and play back. So the particles flies and then they turn blue as they inside of the turbulence field. Since most of the time you don't want the particles to be affected by the field, I mean, if you don't want to be too affected, you can always put really small value for the magnitude. Okay, so let's say like 0.1 for example. So the impact of the field on the particle motion or on the particle velocity will be minimum, but yet the particle will be affected. So just to continue the same idea with this example, instead of like turning the particle colors into blue, we can instead kill the particles, and that's just as simple as affecting the RGB-PP attribute. So let's say right click on lifespan attribute, choose runtime before dynamic expression, and instead of particle shape RGB-PP is equal to new sign, we can say lifespan pp is equal to 0, and that statement will kill the particle. Edit, close, rewind back, and let's play back again, and you have the same result. So now instead of using a volumetric shape, right, we can just specify the world coordinates, for example, where the particle needs to be killed. And for this particular case, let's just delete the turbulence field. And since the turbulence field already used an expression, and expression might get confused reading the trying to read the attribute that is not existent, let's just delete that part of the expression and comment the one that exists. Okay, so runtime before expression, we just cancel it. Okay, so let's rewind back, play back, and you can see nothing is actually happens anymore. But what we can do, we can display, let's switch to particle render type from being point as being numeric. Okay, so with numeric particle type, we can display per particle attributes as numbers. And in order to specify what exactly attribute we would like to display, we need to hit the current render type button, and as you can see, particle ID is a default number. So let's rewind back, and instead of particle ID, put position. Position will instruct Maya to display particle position attributes. Let's go to emitter and change the rate from 100 to 10, so the playbacks is faster. Or another approach, instead of changing the rate attribute, you can go into particle shape node and change the level of detail to percentage factor or multiplier. So instead of like dealing with the, especially in the case when you animated your particle rate and you don't want to like cancel the curve, you always can reduce the number of the calculations by using level of detail. So now if I play back, we can see that that the particles being represented with its own world coordinates, with the first number is equal to x, second is y, and third is z. Okay, so like this is a typical vector value data type, right? So very similar to RGB-PP. As a matter of fact, if I change position numeric display to RGB-PP, I will be displaying color attribute that we just defined in the creation expression a few minutes earlier. So let's back to position here, position, okay, and let's go into runtime expression. Right click on lifespan pp and say runtime before expression. Uncomment what I did, or type back what if you deleted the entire expression, or runtime expression, and put if float instead of float field. Well, first we need to then capture the coordinates the world coordinates of the particles. And for that, we declare a variable type of vector. Once again, just like with our GBPP, with the color attribute, it's a vector data type. We need a vector variable to capture that data, and we say vector, and then we say pose, which stands for position. It can be any name. Don't forget the $sign before the name of the variable, is equal to position. You can type just like this position, and it will read each particle position and feed it into this particular variable. If you'd like to, you can put the entire name of the attribute that precedes with the name of the shape node of the particle, like this. It does not matter, because if you omit the name of the particle, Maya will fill the rest next time you reopen expression. Let's demonstrate it. Okay, edit, close. So as you see, I'm using position here without the name of the particle. And now if I right click runtime before dynamics, and you can see that the Maya already appended the name of the particle in front of the position. So here I have a vector position stored in a vector variable pose. Now I need a y coordinate. Let's say I would like to kill any particle that travels any further than 10 units along y positive axis. And for this, I declare a new float variable called position in y, and I equal to second number stored in a vector variable pose. And I use this particular syntax, which y corresponds to second number, x would be corresponding to the first number stored in the vector variable, and the z would be to the third. But since we read in y-axis, we're interested in the second number, and it conveniently falls under the same syntax. In this particular case, it's y. Okay, I hit edit. Okay, now I know the each particle position, and I store it in a position y float variable type. So now the next would be the if statement, where I would compare the y position of the particles. So I would say if position in y of particles is more than, for example, 10, right? Then do something. And this particular I say particle shape is equal, particle shape lifespan pp is equal 0. What I do, I actually terminate the particle if it travels any further than 10 units in y. So I play back this, and as we can see, the particle is being killed. The disadvantage of this method is that you're not able you are able to animate, but you would have to do it through the expression, or you would have to link animation of another object attribute to this particular variable here. Is more work to do, more typing, less interactive than working with the fields. The fields allows you to, the fields can be parented to another object and such. So another example of the quite often used technique is to assign per particle attribute that would control the influence of the field. And here's the scene that I put together. That's something that we would recreate now. So let's just go into File, New Scene, create as a emitter a polygon sphere, and let's go to Particle menu, Emit from Object, choose Surface as a emitter type, and 0 the speed of the emission, meaning the particles will be emitted with no speed. And for the go to the frame number 2, specify the rate of emission as 10,000. Right click and say set key. Advance to frame number 3 and put the emission 0. So 10,000 on frame number 2, and on frame number 3 it's 0. So it's emitting one frame only. So let's play back. Yes, so we have the particle emitted and they're not moving. Let's specify the last frame of simulation as a 400. Playback, just to verify everything is correct. Okay, so now let's select the particle system, go to field, and say volume axis field. By default, it creates a cube shaped field. Let's change it to the sphere. Let's scale it up and let's play back. So as you can see, every particle that was emitted moves exactly in the same fashion. There's no random factor to it, and we're gonna change it. Right now the magnitude of the field is being controlled by the magnitude attribute of the field itself. In order to access this attribute, we need to select the field, go to attribute editor, and change the magnitude from, let's say, default 5 to 1. If we do that, every particle is being affected in exactly the same fashion. So let's rename the volume axis field from volume axis field 1 to volume axis field only, and copy the name of the field. We will be using it a minute later. So now select the particle, go to particle shape, and add per particle attribute. Click general button, and as a data type, choose float. Attribute type is per particle, and you can paste the copied name of the field into the field called loan name. So that's a name of the attribute that we're about to create. The technique that I'm referring to is to, if we create a per particle attribute that starts, name of which starts with the name of the field, and then underscore word magnitude, then Maya will recognize this per particle attribute as the field that is being driven by the as an attribute that will be driven by the field that is connected to the particle. The first portion of the attribute name should correspond to the name of the field that is being connected to the particle, and the second portion of the attribute name should correspond to the attribute of the field that is being linked to. So let's click OK. And now if we play back simulation, the particles are not moving since they are not affected by the field any longer. In order to make a particle being affected by the field again, we need to specify the magnitude of the field that's got an impact on the particle. And to do so, we can right click and say create expression, copy paste the name of the attribute to the expression window, and here we can specify is equal to 5, for example. By doing so, we assign the same value to each particle. So now we're about to recreate what we already had before the per particle attribute was created. In order to really benefit from this technique is to randomize, for example, this function. So let's say we would use a random function and specify, let's say, a value between 0.1, 0.1 and 5. Then each particle now receives different magnitude value for the field. So even while all the particles being assigned to the same field and driven by the same field, each particle has got its own magnitude value. So I would like to talk a little bit about the fluids overview, and for that let's create a 3D container with the emitter. The default settings would be just fine for this example. And let's just quickly go through the major main attributes of the fluid. First of all, the very top function disable evaluation checkbox will stop evaluation of the fluid container. There is a situation when, while working with the high resolution fluid containers, let's say if the resolution exceeds number 500 by 500 by 500, and you would like to change it to even higher number, changing those resolution numbers could become quite slow for a computer to process. It's not rare where the change of resolution could take up to 15-20 minutes. Disabling evaluation for this particular purpose will make no difference. I found that in order to switch a resolution quickly without experiencing any slowback, it would be much more efficient if density and velocity and temperature and fuel pull down menus will be set to off instead of choosing the disable evaluation checkbox. Disable evaluation checkbox is good in situation when you would like to scroll through the timeline without the fluid being evaluated at each frame. Keep voxel square is something that appears to be like with Maya 2011 or so, and it's a shortcut to be able to change the size of the fluid with the resolution being updated automatically. I usually prefer working with the multiplier for the size. So for example, I would choose a number that I would use to multiply the size of the container with some consistent number. So for example, if I would be working with multiplier of 10, then every time the size of the container is changed, the multiplier will be multiplied against the size. So the multiplier of 10 would produce a resolution of 100, 100, and 100. If the size in Y would be changed to 5, then the resolution would be changed to 50 along the Y-axis. Boundary X and Y and Z is a self-explanatory. So if it's selected as a both sides or minus, it would act as a kind of wall against which not just the fluid cannot escape, but also the velocity. And that's as important as the density itself or as the temperature, is because being able to build the fuel pressure against the wall is most of the time serves as a technique to build an interest in the fluid simulation. So most of the time choose none for X and none for Z, and having closed floor of the container, which is negative and minus Y, would be a good choice. The dynamic grid for density and dynamic grid is for the velocity is the most common way to start simulating. If there is a need for temperature and fuel, then those two options becomes available as well. The display tab would control how the fluid is being represented in Maya viewport, as a render is probably one of the most commonly used choices. Slices per voxels never actually been changed. Voxel quality is faster. It's still quite slow even for the fastest machine I worked on. Boundary draw is a bounding box because anything else with none you're not able to select the fluid. With full it's too busy, and other option is also not as good as a bounding box. Numeric display is very valuable tool for analyzing the fluid simulation. We would be talking about this later. Wireframe display available as a particles choice is not really helpful because the representation of the density as a particles is not given enough information, so off would be a better choice. Velocity draw will display the velocity vectors, and it's also very good tool for visualizing the simulation. Gravity. The gravity works in as a multiplier really for the attribute that we would be able to find under the content detail density. So the density has a attribute called buoyancy, and we also have a gravity. The gravity and the buoyancy is always multiplied against each other. Having gravity of 1 and buoyancy of 9.8 would result in exactly the same simulation. It also can be a negative number, and then the gravity would be reversed. Okay, we will be talking about the practical application for these attributes later. Viscosity is, it sounds like, will create a will make simulation feel viscous. Friction is actually a rarely used attribute and most likely would never be used. Damp sometimes is helpful to put like a very small number, very small number, just to stabilize the simulation. Substeps is being used for fast simulations, or when there is a emitter that moves very fast. But recent releases of Maya were updated with the attribute that could be found under the emitters. They call motion streak, that takes care about any fast moving objects. So I would use a motion streak instead of the emitting substeps, which would slow down simulation dramatically and yet not produce as accurate result as a motion streaks. And then we have a simulation rate scale. I would recommend of using a number of 2 or 3. Higher numbers will produce artifacts and make a simulation unstable. 3 is my preferred number for this attribute because it produces a quite interesting simulation without need to wait for too many frames. Start frame, just with the particles, controls the first frame of the simulation. Liquid outer resize is quite specific attributes that could be discussed later. Self-attraction and repulsion controls the attributes that works in conjunctions with the liquid. Density scale is actually a multiplier that controls two things. It would control the how dense the density is during render time, and it also affects the simulation. So if density scale number attribute changed after the fluid was cached, then there will be apparently no impact on the simulation itself, and this number will only control the render quality. But if while working on the render quality settings, this attribute was changed in an attempt to get specific look, and then simulation would be rerun, it could produce a quite unexpected results, because now with different density scale number, simulation is being affected, and it could, like many times, the answer for the unexpected change in a simulation could be behind of this attribute. The buoyancy, once again, is just a simple multiplier. You could leave it at 1 and forget once and forever and just use a gravity instead. The gravity attribute, since we return to it, only works with the densities, has no impact on a temperature. The temperature gravity, let's turn on the temperature to dynamic grid, because this is the only way to display temperature attributes. And the temperature buoyancy is kind of it has its own gravity, let's say, and instead of being split into two attributes like with the density, buoyancy plus gravity, the temperature has only one attribute, buoyancy. It can be positive or it can be negative. Back to density, diffusion controls the blurriness, how fast the density blurs as it moves within the container. The result of this attribute is quite evident, and it's easy to be experimented and observed during the simulation. Only very small numbers usually used in a real production, like a really small float numbers. Dissipation controls how fast the density will dissipate away. It's a valuable attribute to control the aside from the dissipation of the density, is being used to control dissipation of the velocity, because as soon as the velocity being emitted into the fluid voxel, it would take a quite substantial amount of time for this velocity to dissipate or zero down. So the dissipation value here could be used to cool down the velocity within the container and within its voxels. Something that we should mention during practical classes. Noise would introduce a noise to the density only, and only to the density. The tension, and for those relatively new attributes, quite useful and should be used only, by my opinion, to make a final tweaks to the simulation, and not the attributes that I would change as a very first thing. Velocity scale is probably better to leave at 1 for all 3 axes. Swirl could be useful as small as 0.05 and up to 10. Any higher number than 10 will most likely produce artifacts. Noise is more brutal than swirl. I would rarely use noise for the velocity. Turbulence is like one uniform field that's been applied to entire container, and instead of using a turbulence field here, it would be probably better to use a turbulence from a field menu, because of turbulence found under the field menu has much more choices. One important things to remember is that the velocity that is being emitted from a turbulence attribute is additive, meaning like every frame the simulation run, the velocity vector of the container will keep modified and most likely grow to the point when simulation will become unstable and crash. The temperature tab of the fluid container attribute controls the temperature. Grid of the fluid, and several attributes are exactly the same to the density, except the turbulence, I believe, or velocity or density now has got turbulence as well. No, the density still does not have a it's got noise being introduced, but no turbulence. So the turbulence used to be the only attribute that would make a temperature different from a density. We will discuss the temperature and density in more details later and how they could be used together. The fuel attributes are quite straightforward when become also clear when we go through the practical example. The grid cache, that's quite something that needs to be remembered here, is that every time the fluid simulation is being cached, this is the place to choose what exactly attributes will be written to the fluid cache, because it's not uncommon when the cache size per frame can exceed the gigabyte, and there's also size limitation, as I remember, for the fluid cache. Last time I dealt with the large or high resolution containers, the size of the maximum size of the fluid cache could not be larger than 1.8 gigabyte per frame, and there is a way to get around that. So for example, if you cache density, velocity, temperature, fuel, all three attributes will be written to the same cache file. And if you'd like to get a little extra room for to squeeze into that 2 gigabyte limit barrier, it is possible to cache those attributes separately and then combine them later during render time, but still a quite limitation to have a size barrier for the cache. Taking into account, it's quite easy to generate 2 gigabyte cache file size per frame. Surface tab would give you option to choose between volume render and a surface render. Surface render will turn the fluid into the kind of polygon representation of the simulation. Later you would be able to convert the fluid to polygon using modify tool, convert fluid to polygon. And there are a few options available in this tab. Environment, to say true, never used that attribute before. Output mesh would give you option between like a quads or triangle. Shading is given a few controls for controlling transparency. That's transparency that acts on an entire container. Glow intensity and such would be probably better controlled in post. Drop off shape is set to default 0.5. I usually put it to 0 and off. And color, that's for the density, but you can choose like other options. You can turn center gradient and such. Those attributes here are quite interactive, and it's really easy to study them just by playing with the numbers. The incandescency attribute usually used with the when there is a need to render fluid as fire, or if there is a fire in a simulation. And by default it's set to temperature, but I'm sure you can, and I did it in the past, achieve the exactly same look by shading density instead. That would save simulation time and avoid the need to cache temperature. The opacity ramp allows you to slice through the voxels and such. So for example, you would be able to, for example, just display or render specific voxels, or voxels with the specific density only. And you also given a choice what exactly grid or what attribute of the fluid you would like to use this ramp with. The matte opacity is very similar to the geometry attribute. Shading quality 1 is 99% of usage. I noticed that some people prefer to raise this number up to 5 when fire is being rendered, but since there is quite a tendency these days to use third-party renders such as V-Ray, is shading quality attribute is not really making any difference while using V-Ray. The textures and such would give a tremendous amount of control to use a texture or 3D texture as opacity and such, but since I always looking for I'm trying to recreate a simulation using dynamics, I barely rely on texturing. As a matter of fact, I never use the textures for the simulations. And lightning, self shadows will turn self shadowing on and should be used every time the smoke is being rendered. The only time when you want to turn self shadows off is when simulation is intended to be rendered as a fire. The real light option gives you option to use a built-in light, or the fluid will be following the real light scenario. The render stats is just like with any type of geometry, allows you to choose to cast shadows in now. And then the rest of the attributes is actually the same attributes that could be found under any polygons or NURB surface. So that's a very, very quick overview of the fluid attributes, and this is just a really short introduction into these attributes. And I also would like to mention that there is a lot of potential behind of using a fluid with the fluid emitters alone, meaning like there's quite a wide range of simulation possible to achieve by using fluid emitters alone. But there are times, and quite often, when using emitters is not sufficient to get the look you need. That's when you would like to start utilizing the particles as the emitters. And the basic concept behind of this is that you create a particle system, whether it's emitted from an emitter or from a geometry, and as a particle is being simulated, let's say, or evaluated, you give them a specific per particle attributes and link them to the fluid to drive fluid attributes. One of the most common attributes that you would like to use with the particles is so-called per point emission rate. If I select this particle and go to particle shape node, you would see that by selecting the particle per point emission rate, no valid field emitter. Well, I need to say that emit from particle first. That you need to specify. You first turn the particles into the emitters, and then you build a set of the custom per particle attributes that would be used to emit one or several fluid attributes into the fluid container. And so far, I would say it's very stable. It's very predictable, and if there's a quite good understanding of the particle simulation themselves, it's easy to get a quite predictable result with integration of both entities into one simulation. There will be a practical example on that in later classes, in future classes. So for now, just let's get familiar ourselves with basic concept and basic attributes. And I welcome everyone at least get familiar with the name of the attributes. It's not really maybe important during the first class to learn all the attributes or attempt to learn attributes. At least, just get familiar with the names of the attributes. Knowing the names of the attributes themselves would make learning them easier later, because there would be no need to memorize the attribute names. Alright, I hope to see you next week.